Hey there, this is Dan from MacLeod D&D, and welcome to Riddle and Rule, a channel that I've made to cover the transition between D&D 5th edition from the 2014 book to now the 2024 book. I'm going to cover some highlights in this video, things that I think are particularly exciting for us to see as a first glance at the book. Let's hop right in. So the first thing I want us to see that I'm particularly excited for is this concept of the D20 test. This is laid out right at the beginning of the book as part of the how to play D&D, and they've kind of bundled the concept of D20 rolls and are calling them D20 tests. There's some implications about this I'm curious about, but there's at least one thing that I think is really helpful for this, which is just the clarity of language. There have been times where I've been teaching other people attack rolls, skill checks, and saving throws, and the fact that they now have the same name in this one bundle of being called D20 tests, I think is just some clarity of language that makes playing D&D and talking about D&D easier. Now, I mentioned the implications earlier, and one implication I think might be worth looking out for in the book is abilities and spells that impact all D20 tests. Now that there's a name for it, I think that is sufficient language to then be used to make easier references to all of those particular types of rolls. So there might be a spell that grants advantage to D20 tests, or disadvantage to D20 tests, or in some way gives buffs or boons to the whole concept, and I'm wondering if that's one of the reasons why they might have made that change. So, whether it's just to make it easier to say for D20. The second thing I'm really interested in and excited to see in this book are the updates that they made to the action economy. And so part of this first chapter in playing the game, they also outline different actions that you can take in combat. And so that list of actions are attack, dash, disengage, dodge, help, hide, influence, magic, ready, search, study, and utilize. So there's a couple that are new to this list that were not in the original 2014 list. The familiar ones are attack, dash, disengage, dodge, help, hide, ready, search, and utilize, but even just parts of search. And so we also now have study, magic, and influence as some new outlined actions that people can take during combat. And I think that this was just a very helpful move, and here's why. During combat, often players do want to ask, hey, can I try to persuade this guy that we're actually not his target? Or can I get that bear to maybe calm down and not attack us right now? And all of that was left up to the DM's discretion to say, yes, you can, or no, you can't, or is this an action? And so they've just clearly laid out the rule. They said, yes, influence is an action that you can take during combat. And so I think just outlining that and making that clear is really helpful. Second, magic as an action is a new concept, but what you're doing with that isn't new. Casting a spell, using a magic item, or using a magical feature. I'm really curious as to why they decided to make magic an action, because those things already existed. So I imagine there might be some implications. There are going to be some features or abilities that then disable people from taking the magic action. Interesting, because stopping somebody from casting a spell, okay, we can see that. But stopping somebody from using a magic item or a magical feature, I'm wondering what environments, what spells, features, and actions might take place that stop somebody from taking the magic action. Something I also want to be keeping an eye out for the rest of this book. And then lastly, the study action is new, making an intelligence check. So things like religion, arcana, history, investigation, and nature. I do appreciate that this is there and clearly making this an action, though sometimes I feel like doing these things should be less than an action. So if somebody wants to maybe recall something, remember something, or look over one of their enemies and try to figure out, have I seen one of these before, or what types of magical abilities might it have? I want to make that worth a whole action. And so I'm curious as to how that will play out once we get some games going with study being an action. Sometimes I feel like it should be less. Another highlight I want to make that's new to the 2024 book is the parts of a background section. This is in chapter 4, discussing character origins. This is starting to get into some character creation here, and what it outlines is a completely different approach to ability scores than what we saw in 2014. So, parts of a background now include ability scores, and each background lists 3 of your character's ability scores, and you can increase one by 2 and another by 1, or you can increase all by 3. And so this is wonderful. I'm so happy that this is now tied to background instead of what was formerly called race and now called species. And here's why. Ability scores being tied to your background is a very freeing move for our character creation processes. Now, if we want to increase our intelligence or our wisdom or our strength, our prior jobs for our characters or their origins of how they became an adventurer now influence their abilities that they have, instead of what is naturally normal for a particular race or species to have. That's a really good move for us. We are now free to consider concepts like a Minotaur wizard or a halfling fighter, which normally would have been a suboptimal move where our ability scores are now less and worse because of the class and race combo that we've chosen. Now is a freed up interaction where we can choose, let me be that Minotaur wizard, and my ability score is now going to come from my sage background instead of the race that I chose. Really good move here. It allows us to have some more creative character concepts coming out of this new book. Love that. Next is also a feat. A background gives your character a specified origin feat. This is really cool because now we're going to see some of our familiar feats and even some new ones automatically given to us based on our background. This change from in the 2014 book, where the most reliable way to get an early feat was going to be picking the human variant as your class or as your race. Now, again, you get some abilities and some new features just based on your work and your background and your origin. And I love that they've made this an easier thing to access as part of our character creation. And then lastly, things that we're familiar with: skill proficiencies, tool proficiencies, and equipment. This is what we're normally associating with part of a background, and they just enhanced it and made it more of a dynamic part of our abilities and features. Loving that. The last thing I want to talk about is a subclass that I'm really excited to get to see played out. It's a rewrite of an old subclass that we're familiar with a new name and some new abilities. And this subclass is the Path of the Wildheart Barbarian. It was formerly the Totem Warrior type of barbarian, and they made some really good updates that I'm excited for. So one of the things is, when you hit level 3, Rage of the Wilds is now where you get your animal influence to your rage. And the first options you get are bear, eagle, and wolf. First thing, big change, is every time you rage, you can choose bear, eagle, or wolf. This is different than the 2014 version, where once you hit level 3, you chose your totem and you stuck with that totem for the rest of the campaign. Now, you can adapt. Now you can choose a different wild rage based on the circumstances that you're in, and the options are great. We're familiar with bear. You have resistance to every damage type except force, necrotic, psychic, and radiant. Now we have Eagle, where when you activate the rage, you can disengage and dash immediately as part of raging, and as bonus actions later off in that combat. And that bonus action is both the disengage and the dash. Love that. And then there's Wolf. While your rage is active, your allies have advantage on attack rolls on any enemy within 5 feet of you. Very cool. The one I'm excited for is that Eagle. That type of movement and dynamic combat that you're going to get out of this barbarian is going to be really good. And pairing that off with the level 14 Power of the Wilds is where I got really excited. So if you pick that Eagle Rage, and now you can move around the combat super easily without being attacked by other enemies, you also can now pick the Ram. While your rage is active, you can cause a large or smaller creature to have the prone condition when you hit it with a melee attack. The possibility for this barbarian to then run around combat, hitting everything and knocking it prone without worrying about taking hits because it's moving in and out of different creatures' ranges is really cool. And this is at the heart of a lot of the changes they were aiming for when redoing classes and subclasses in this book. A big theme that they were wanting to kind of correct and improve on is, how do we get our characters to move around in combat more? Because in older combat, what we saw often was combat would start, and within the first turn or two, a character would get up against the creature that they were trying to fight, and then they would just stay there for the entire combat, because leaving that creature's range and taking an opportunity attack was just a high risk that nobody wanted to take. And so we're going to see a lot more ways for us to move our characters around combat without provoking attacks of opportunity, and I think that that's going to be a really good and fun move to make our combat a little more fluid, a little more moving, and less static, and less just boring. So that's the subclass I'm excited for. Let me know which subclass you're excited for as you are looking over this new and updated book as well. Stick around on this channel for more videos. I'm going to be deep diving different sections of this book and highlighting each class down to their subclasses, pointing out some of the differences and some of the improvements that I see as we're looking over this book.